Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Apocrypha Apocalypse. I'm Gary Machuda, and we're continuing our series looking at early church father list of Old Testament books. And we've gone through quite a few. This episode, we're going to take a quick look at Gregory of Nazianzus. I think it's probably going to be a shorter video. There's not a lot of information that it gives us. But nevertheless, we are going to look at it in detail and see what Gregory believed about these books that we call the Deuterocanon, that Protestants call Apocrypha. All right, everybody, let's look at Gregory of Nazianzus. He was born 329, died 390, so he lived right up till the end or near the end of the 4th century. Of course, this is during the lifetime of Jerome, so we're getting later in the list. And he provides a list that is often appealed to, at least the list is, or his name is appealed to, as supporting the Protestant canon or rejecting the Deuterocanon. So let's take a closer look at the list. It's found in a work called Carmina Dogmatica. Specifically, we're looking at Book 1, Section 1, Carmen 12. Which reads as follows. The divine oracles should always be on the tongue and in the mind be rehearsed, for God will indeed give reward for his labor, so that you may obtain light from anything hidden, or, what is far better, that you may be spurred by God to greater purity, and thirdly, be called away from the cares of the world by such study. But let not extraneous books seduce your mind. For many malignant writings have been disseminated. Accept, O friend, this my approved number. These are all 12 of the historical books of the most ancient Hebrew wisdom. First there is Genesis, then Exodus, Leviticus 2, then Numbers, then the Second Law, then Joshua and Judges. Ruth is 8th, 9th and 10th books, the Acts of Kings and Chronicles. Last you have Ezra. The poetic books are 5, Job being the first, then David, then 3 of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, Canticles, and Proverbs. And similarly, 5 of prophetic inspiration. There are 12 written in one book, Hosea and Amos, and Micah is the third, then Joel and Jonah, Obadiah, Nahum also, and Habakkuk and Zephaniah, Haggai, then Zechariah and Malachi. All these are one. The second is of Isaiah, and then the one called as an infant, Jeremiah, then Ezekiel, and the gift of Daniel. I count, therefore, 22 of the ancient books, corresponding to the number of Hebrew letters. Now count also those of the new mystery. Matthew wrote the miracles of Christ for the Hebrews, Mark for Italy, Luke for Greece, John for all, the great herald who walked in the heavens. Then the Acts of the wise apostles. Of Paul, there are 14 epistles, and the 7th Catholic, 1 of James, 2 of Peter, 3 of John also, and Jude is the 7th. You have them all, and if there are any beyond these, they are not genuine. So the reason for this list seems fairly straightforward. During the time of Gregory, he says that, quote, many malignant writings have been disseminated. Now, this is the true Apocrypha. These are forgeries that disseminate falsehoods. So in light of that, he wants to provide his number. And I think this is really the key here. He's not appealing to church usage. He's not appealing to the tradition of the elders or the books that are appointed by the fathers, as we've seen in other lists. But here he says in 2 places that this comes from his own opinion. For example, he says, accept, O friend, this my approved number. And he does that right before he introduces the Old Testament. And then when he concludes the Old Testament, he says, I count, therefore, 22 of the ancient books corresponding to the number of the Hebrew letters. So this appears to be his own personal opinion of those books that are undoubtedly genuine, in which he recommends the person he's writing these to read. And by that, I think he means that these are the undoubted, indisputable books of Scripture. Now, with that in mind, and I don't think this is controversial at all, he restricts the number only to those books that are in no way disputed by anybody. So, of course, the Deuterocanon is disputed by the Jews, so he doesn't put the Deuterocanon in this list. He sticks to the Proto-canon except for, and this is interesting, he omits the book of Esther. Now, as we've learned in other videos in this series, is that the book of Esther had been disputed by the rabbis all the way through the 4th century. In fact, several Christian lists omit the book of Esther. The rabbis doubted whether or not Esther was to be considered a sacred writing. So he omits Esther, and then curiously enough, he also omits the book of Revelation. And again, this makes sense because at this point in time, not all Christians were on board with the sacredness or the inspiration of the book of Revelation. So his list is basically those books whose genuineness as sacred inspired scripture is indisputable. But that doesn't really tell us much in and of itself about the books that are disputed. For example, the Deuterocanon, that's disputed by the rabbis. And in some sense, it doesn't even tell us a lot about the New Testament either. In fact, there's a very interesting thing that goes on here. And this has been noted by a lot of scholars who specialize in the New Testament canon, is that it appears that Gregory seems to have accepted Revelation, although he did not include it in the list. And I think this is telling what's going on in the list. So let's take a closer look. For example, Gregory, when he was introducing or describing John the Apostle as the author of the Gospel of John, he describes him as he who walked in the heavens. Now, this strongly suggests that Gregory of Nazianzus believed that John was the author of the book of Revelation, along with the Gospel. Yet, when he writes down the books of the New Testament, he omits Revelation from there. And that brings up something kind of awkward, because how could he believe that an inspired apostle wrote Revelation and yet not include it in the list? If his intention is to list all the books that in no way are disputed, then he could hold the book of Revelation to be inspired scripture, but it wouldn't be on this list because it is disputed by other people. Not himself, but by other people. You get the drift. That's true with book of Revelation. It certainly is true with the Deuterocanon. And so let's look at everything else that Gregory of Nazianzus has wrote, and especially how did he use the Deuterocanon in his writings? Did he believe it was just mere human apocrypha, incapable of confirming doctrine? Well, when you look at the evidence, you see, no, it's completely the opposite. Okay, our first example comes from Gregory of Nazianzus, Oration 43. We'll start in section 70. And here he's eulogizing his good friend Basil, and he's likening Basil's life to those that are found in Scripture. It starts off, it says, quote, "Come then, there have been many men of old days, illustrious for piety, as lawgivers, generals, prophets, teachers, and men brave to the shedding of blood. Let us compare our pellet with them, and thus recognize his merit. Adam was honored by the hand of God and the lights of paradise." Now he continues, and as we look at everybody that he mentions Adam, Enos, Enoch, Abraham, Rebecca, Jacob, Job, Moses, Aaron, Joshua, Judges, David, Solomon, Elijah, Elisha, the 3 children in the furnace, and Daniel, Jonah, Daniel, and the Maccabean martyrs. Interesting enough. Now, what's really curious is once he finishes this list of Old Testament saints that he is likening Basil to, he says in section 75, "And now I turn to the New Testament," and comparing his life to those who are here illustrious. Now, obviously, he's drawing these from the pages of the Old Testament, and notice that the Maccabean martyrs were part of his Old Testament. He counts them along with all these others, makes no distinction between them. Likewise, in his Oration 7:1, He says, but even in my tears and admiration, I must respect the law, which regards such matters. Nor is this alien to our philosophy, for he says, quote, the memory of the just is accompanied with eulogies. This is a quote from Proverbs 10:7, according to the Septuagint. And also, quote, let tears fall down over the dead and begin to lament as if thou suffered great harm thyself. And this is a quote from Sirach 38:16. Both Proverbs and Sirach are considered by him part of the law in regards to these matters. Again, this likens both texts as authoritative in some sense. However, even more explicitly in Oration 45:15, he says the following. Then the last and the gravest plague upon the persecutors, truly worthy of the night, and Egypt mourns the firstborn of her own reasonings and actions, which are also called in the scriptures the seed of the Chaldeans. Now, seed of Chaldeans comes directly from Judith 5:6. So here we have Gregory of Nazianzus quoting Judith explicitly as scripture. In Oration 28:8, Gregory says, and how shall we preserve the truth that God pervades all things and fills all things? As it is written, quote, do not I fill heaven and earth, saith the Lord? That's from Jeremiah 23:24. And, quote, the Spirit of the Lord filleth the world. That is Wisdom 1:7. So there's a couple of things going on here. First, we have an explicit formal citation. It is written, given both for the book of Jeremiah and for wisdom. Second, we have both texts confirming doctrine because he is concerning God's omnipresence, that God's presence pervades all things and fills all, to which he cites Jeremiah and the Book of Wisdom. So he's confirming doctrine with the Book of Wisdom alongside Jeremiah without any distinction or qualification. In Oration 32, we also see, if you have the word of understanding, answer, says Scripture, and no one will hold you back. If not, put a curb on your lips. That's a quote from Sirach 5:12. Notice again, he cites it explicitly as sacred scripture. In Oration 44:4, he says, but since through the envy of the evil one, death entered the world, the fraudulently seduced mankind, this is why God became man and suffers with our suffering, and through encasement in flesh becomes poor, so that by his poverty we might become rich. Now, this is very interesting. Here he's quoting from the Book of Wisdom. He is applying it to his reasoning for God becoming man and suffering. Oration 24:1, he says, and at the outset, let us express our gratitude that it is at such an opportune moment and according to God's good measures, who orders and regulates all things by weight and measure. Now, this is interesting because he predicates God's good measures with a quote from the Book of Wisdom. In other words, wisdom is kind of explicating God's good measures according to Gregory of Nazianzus. Not something you would expect to find in a human, uninspired, apocryphal work. Now, here is something fascinating. This is going to be a long paragraph, but it's worth going through. Oration 29, section 17. He says, for we have learnt to believe in and teach the deity of the Son from their great and lofty utterances. And what utterances are these? Okay, so he says, we're going to confirm the divinity, the deity of the Son by these great utterances. These, God, the Word, he that was in the beginning and with the beginning, and the beginning. Quote, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, John 1:1. And, quote, with thee is the beginning, unquote, Psalm 110:3. And, quote, he who calleth her the beginning from generations, unquote, Isaiah 41:4. Then the Son is only begotten, the only, quote, begotten Son which is in the bosom of the Father, it says, he hath declared him, unquote. That's from John 1:18. The way, the truth, the life, the light. Quote, I am the way, the truth, and the life, unquote. And, quote, I am the light of the world, unquote. John 7:12, 9:5. Wisdom and power, quote, Christ, the wisdom of God and the power of God, quoting 1 Corinthians 1:24. The effulgence, the impress, the image, the seal, quote, who being the effulgence of his glory and the impress of his essence, Hebrews 1:3. And, quote, the image of his goodness, unquote. That comes from Wisdom 7:26. And, quote, he hath God the Father sealed, John 7:27. Now, after continuing on, he says, all which is clearly spoken of the Son, with all the other passages of the same force, none of which is an afterthought or added later to the Son or the Spirit, any more than to the Father himself. And then he concludes by saying, there never was a time when he was without the Word, or when he was not the Father, or when he was not true, or not wise, or not powerful, or devoid of life, or of splendor, or of goodness. Now, here he's recapping all of these images. Notice that last one is again a repeat of what is written in Wisdom 7:26. This is being used as a lofty utterance about the Son's divinity, the Son's deity, if you will. Now, this might sound a little familiar because back when we were looking at Athanasius of Alexandria's writings, we noticed how he too used these illustrations, or what he called paradigma, to describe the relationship of the Father and the Son. And he drew these illustrations from the Proto-canon and also from the Wisdom 7:26 and 27. The same thing is being done here by Gregory of Nazianzus, again to confirm a very important thing, namely the divinity of Christ as anchored in the scriptures, the utterances of God. Frankly, I can't think of a better example of a text being used to confirm doctrine than this. Moving on, in Oration 13th, that's his fourth theological oration, he quotes Baruch 3 to refute the use of John 17:3 and 1 Timothy 1:17, that the Father is the only God, not the Son. Gregory writes, quote, it would be best of all if we can persuade you of this. But if not, what will you say to the suggestion on the other side, that on your hypothesis, the Son has been called the only God? In what passage? Why, in this. This is our God. None other shall be accounted in comparison with him. And a little further on, after this, he did show himself upon earth and conversed with men. This addition proves clearly that the words are not used of the Father, but of the Son. For it was he who in bodily form companied with us and was in this lower earth. Again, very strong confirmation about the deity of Christ drawn from the Deuterocanonical book of Baruch. And as we noted, Baruch is nowhere found in Gregory's list. So we see from these texts, and there's a lot more we can give, that Gregory of Nazianzus believed the Deuterocanon to be part of Scripture. He includes them among the Old Testament. He quotes them explicitly as Scripture. He quotes them formally. And most important of all, he uses them to confirm doctrine, especially very important doctrine concerning the Son. With all those things in mind, we are forced to conclude that Gregory of Nazianzus held them to be Scripture in their fullest sense. Which then raises the question, if he really believed that, then why didn't he list them And as we pointed out, I think the best way to reconcile the usage with the list is to see the list as being those books that were indisputable, that no one spoke against. And this is going to be seen in later lists, especially after the 4th century. I don't think we're going to continue the series past the African councils, though. But you'll see Christians who will try to make lists similar to Gregory in that they will have the indisputed books of scripture, they'll have the books that are spoken against, that there is some dispute, and then they'll have the books that are to be rejected. And again, it's no shock, I think, for anybody that the Jews disputed these books. The difficulty is trying to find evidence where Christians disputed these books or rejected these books. The closest we've seen so far in our investigation is Julius Africanus in his combat with Origen. And we showed that even that is a little suspicious, because he's really talking more about whether or not Susanna is a later addition to the text of Daniel, not necessarily what we're talking about here. So I think we'll just park the video right there, because that's the evidence, and I think it still could be reconciled quite neatly with this list. We'll just leave it like that, and I hope everybody has a great week. By the way, if you've been enjoying this series or this video, please subscribe, like, and support us on Patreon. We really appreciate it. Everybody have a great week. Bye-bye.